Imagine you are living in a house your family has owned for 10,000 years. Your grandparents were born there. Your children play in the yard. You know every tree, every river, every hill by name. Then one day, strangers arrive at your door. They tell you this land is theirs now. They have a piece of paper that says so. And if you refuse to leave, they will make you. This is not a story from a novel. This is not a fairy tale. This is what happened to the native peoples of North America. And it happened not in ancient history, but within the last 500 years. Some of it happened within the last 100 years. Some of the consequences are still happening today. This is the story of how Native Americans lost their land, and why it matters more than most history books ever tell you. Before we talk about what was taken, we need to understand what existed. When Christopher Columbus landed in 1492, he did not discover an empty continent. He arrived on a land that was already home to tens of millions of people. Historians today estimate that somewhere between 50 million and 100 million people lived in the Americas before European contact. 50 to 100 million. That is not a small village. That is a civilization, actually, many civilizations. In the Pacific Northwest, nations like the Chinook and the Tlingit had sophisticated trade networks stretching hundreds of miles. In the Great Plains, the Lakota and Comanche were masterful horsemen who had developed complex systems of governance and spiritual life. In the Southwest, the Pueblo peoples had been building multi-story stone cities for centuries. The Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy, in the Northeast had a political structure so advanced that some historians argue it directly inspired the United States Constitution. And in Mesoamerica and South America, the Aztec and Inca empires rivaled anything in Europe in terms of population, architecture, and organization. This land was not empty. It was not wild. It was not waiting to be discovered. It was home. And within a few hundred years, most of it would be taken. The first tool of land loss was not a gun. It was a germ. When Europeans arrived, they brought with them diseases that native peoples had never encountered: smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza. Because native populations had no prior exposure, they had no immunity. The results were catastrophic. Smallpox alone wiped out entire villages. In some regions, populations collapsed by 90% within a generation. Think about that. 9 out of every 10 people, gone, before most tribes even saw a European soldier. In many cases, disease arrived ahead of the colonizers themselves, spreading through trade routes and killing people who had never even seen a white face. This demographic collapse had a devastating secondary effect: it made land appear empty. Europeans arrived in regions where towns had stood just decades before, saw overgrown fields and abandoned villages, and concluded that this land was uninhabited, a wilderness ready for the taking. They did not understand, or chose not to understand, that they were looking at the aftermath of a plague they had brought with them. But disease was only the beginning. Spanish conquistadors swept through the Caribbean, Mexico, and the American Southwest with brutal efficiency. Hernán Cortés toppled the Aztec Empire by 1521. Francisco Pizarro destroyed the Inca Empire by the 1530s. The Spanish system of encomienda essentially enslaved indigenous populations, forcing them to work in mines and on plantations. Millions died. In North America, the English, French, and Dutch established colonies along the eastern seaboard. At first, many of these colonies depended on native peoples for food, trade, and survival. The famous story of the Pilgrims at Plymouth in 1620, where the Wampanoag people, led by Massasoit, helped the colonists through their first brutal winter, is a real story. Native generosity and knowledge kept many early European settlements alive. But as the colonies grew stronger, the balance shifted. Land hunger, the insatiable European desire for more farmland and territory, began to override diplomacy. And when diplomacy failed, violence followed. The Pequot War of 1636 to 1638 in New England ended with the near-total destruction of the Pequot people. The Mystic Massacre, where English colonists and their Mohegan and Narragansett allies surrounded a Pequot village and burned it to the ground, killing between 400 and 700 people, mostly women, children, and elderly, in a single night, set a horrifying precedent. It showed that mass violence against native civilians was not just acceptable, it was celebrated. King Philip's War, which erupted in 1675, was one of the bloodiest conflicts in American history relative to population. The Wampanoag leader Metacom, called King Philip by the English, led a desperate coalition of tribes against the expanding English colonies. For a time, it looked like the colonists might actually lose. But by 1676, the coalition collapsed. Metacom was hunted down and killed. His wife and son were sold into slavery. His head was displayed on a pike in Plymouth for 25 years. The message was clear. Resist and you will be destroyed. Now here is where things get deeply uncomfortable, because what happened to Native Americans was not just physical violence. It was also a legal and philosophical project designed to make theft look legitimate. In 1493, Pope Alexander VI issued a papal bull, an official church decree, called Inter Terra. This document declared that any land not inhabited by Christians could be claimed by European monarchs. Just like that. If the people living there were not Christian, the land was legally available for European ownership. This idea became known as the doctrine of discovery. It sounds like something from a medieval fantasy novel, but here is the disturbing part: this doctrine became the foundation of United States land law. In 1823, the Supreme Court of the United States, in a case called Johnson v. Mintosh, ruled that Native Americans could not sell land directly to private individuals because they did not hold full title to it. The court said Native peoples had a right of occupancy, they could live on the land. But the underlying title belonged to the discovering European power, and then to the United States as its successor. This ruling was written by Chief Justice John Marshall, one of the most respected legal minds in American history. And in this ruling, he explicitly invoked the doctrine of discovery, a papal decree from 1493, as the legal justification for why Native Americans could not fully own their own homeland. This ruling has never been overturned. It is still technically active law in the United States today. Legal theft, ratified by the highest court in the land. As the American colonies grew and eventually became an independent nation, the primary tool for acquiring native land shifted, at least officially, to the treaty. A treaty is a formal agreement between two sovereign nations. The United States signed over 500 treaties with native nations between 1778 and 1871. 500. And the United States violated every single one of them. Let that sink in. Every single one. The pattern was almost always the same. The U.S. government would approach a native nation, often after a military campaign had weakened it. They would offer a treaty that granted the tribe ownership of a specific territory, in perpetuity, meaning forever. The tribe would agree, believing they were securing their homeland. Sometimes they understood what they were signing. Often, through bad translation, manipulation, or outright deception, they did not. Then, years or decades later, the United States would find a reason to renegotiate. Gold would be discovered on the territory, as happened in the Black Hills of South Dakota in 1874. Or white settlers would want the land for farming. Or the government would simply decide the previous agreement was inconvenient. A new treaty would be forced on the tribe, usually with a military threat hanging in the background. Or with the explicit manipulation of tribal leaders who had been bribed or threatened. The boundaries would shrink. The permanent homeland would get smaller and smaller. And then it would happen again. The Treaty of Greenville in 1795 gave tribes in Ohio and Indiana certain protections. Within a generation, those protections were meaningless. The treaties with the Cherokee in the early 1800s guaranteed their lands in Georgia. Within 30 years, those treaties were used as waste paper. Perhaps no story better illustrates this than the Trail of Tears. By the early 1800s, 5 native nations in the American Southeast, the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole, had adopted many European American customs. They were called the 5 civilized tribes, a condescending term that the colonizers used because these nations had developed written constitutions, established schools, engaged in agriculture, and in some cases, even adopted Christianity. The Cherokee were particularly remarkable. They had developed a written syllabary, an alphabet, created by a man named Sequoyah, who had never been taught to read or write in English. They published their own newspaper. They established their own Supreme Court. They built prosperous farms and towns. And they had treaties guaranteeing their land in Georgia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Alabama. None of it mattered. Gold was discovered in northern Georgia in 1828, the first major gold rush in American history. Suddenly, the land the Cherokee occupied was enormously valuable. The state of Georgia began passing laws that stripped the Cherokee of their legal rights, seized their lands, and divided their territory in a lottery that distributed it to white settlers. The Cherokee fought back, in court. And they won. The Supreme Court ruled in Worcester v. Georgia in 1832 that Georgia's laws were unconstitutional, that the Cherokee Nation was a sovereign entity, and that the federal government had no right to allow Georgia to seize their lands. President Andrew Jackson reportedly responded, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." Whether he said those exact words or not, his actions spoke clearly. Jackson had already signed the Indian Removal Act in 1830, which authorized the forced relocation of all native nations east of the Mississippi River to lands west of it. And in 1835, a small group of Cherokee leaders, not the elected government of the tribe, signed the Treaty of New Echota, ceding all Cherokee lands. The principal chief of the Cherokee, John Ross, submitted a petition with over 15,000 signatures protesting this fraudulent treaty. Congress ratified it anyway. Between 1836 and 1839, the U.S. Army forcibly removed approximately 16,000 Cherokee people from their homeland and marched them over 1,000 miles to present-day Oklahoma. It was the middle of winter. They were given little food, little shelter, inadequate clothing. People died along the route, of cold, of starvation, of disease, of heartbreak. Approximately 4,000 Cherokee died on what they called Nunadolfsuni, the trail where they cried. We know it as the Trail of Tears. The Choctaw had already been removed in the early 1830s. A Choctaw chief described his experience to a newspaper as a trail of tears and death. The Chickasaw, the Creek, and the Seminole followed, though the Seminole fought back in the Second Seminole War, one of the longest and most expensive Indian wars in American history, before they too were largely subdued. By the 1840s, American expansion had a name and a philosophy, manifest destiny. The idea was simple and seductive. Americans, specifically white Protestant Americans, were destined by God to spread across the entire North American continent, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. This expansion was not conquest. It was divine will. It was civilization spreading over savagery. It was progress. Manifest destiny was not just a vague idea. It was widely published, preached from pulpits, printed in newspapers, painted in famous canvases. In 1872, the painter John Gast created an allegorical painting called American Progress that shows a ghostly angelic white woman floating westward across the continent, holding a schoolbook, stringing telegraph wire, while settlers and trains follow her. Behind her, the land is bright and golden. Ahead of her, fleeing into darkness, are Native Americans, bears, and buffalo. Progress and darkness. Civilization and savagery. The image could not be more explicit. With this ideology as justification, the United States accelerated its expansion. The Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848 added vast territories in the Southwest. The Oregon Territory was acquired from Britain. Gold was discovered in California in 1848. Hundreds of thousands of settlers flooded west on the Oregon Trail, the California Trail, and the Santa Fe Trail. And everywhere they went, they disrupted, displaced, and destroyed native life. The California Gold Rush was particularly catastrophic for native Californians. In 1848, the native population of California was approximately 150,000. By 1870, it had fallen to fewer than 30,000. A combination of massacres, starvation, disease, and forced labor, some of which was legally sanctioned by the California state government, killed more than 100,000 people in roughly 20 years. Some historians call it a genocide. In the Great Plains, the arrival of the Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, brought two devastating consequences. First, it brought tens of thousands more settlers. Second, it brought professional buffalo hunters who, sometimes with government encouragement, slaughtered the American bison almost to extinction. The bison were not just animals to Plains tribes. They were the foundation of entire economies and spiritual traditions. Destroying the buffalo herds was a calculated strategy to destroy the independence of the Plains nations. General Philip Sheridan, who commanded Union forces in the Civil War and later led campaigns against Plains tribes, allegedly said, "The only good Indian is a dead Indian." Whether he said those exact words is debated, but his strategy was clear: destroy the food supply. The native nations of the West did not submit quietly. The Apache Wars lasted from the 1840s to 1886, when Geronimo, one of the last great Apache leaders, finally surrendered after years of eluding thousands of U.S. soldiers. The Nez Perce War of 1877 saw Chief Joseph lead his people on an extraordinary 1,200-mile retreat toward Canada before being captured just 40 miles from the border. His surrender speech, "I will fight no more forever," remains one of the most powerful and heartbreaking statements in American history. The Great Sioux War of 1876 to 1877 produced the most famous Native American military victory against the United States, the Battle of Little Bighorn, where Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors led by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse annihilated the 7th Cavalry Regiment of Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. 260 soldiers died. It became known as Custer's Last Stand. But victory in a single battle could not reverse the tide. The U.S. Army was simply too large, too well supplied, and too willing to target civilians to be defeated in a long war. Within a year of Little Bighorn, the Lakota were confined to reservations. And then came Wounded Knee. On December 29, 1890, a band of approximately 350 Lakota, mostly women, children, and elderly men, were camped along Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota. They were followers of the Ghost Dance, a new spiritual movement that prophesied the return of native prosperity and the disappearance of white settlers. The U.S. government, alarmed by the movement, sent soldiers to disarm the camp. No one knows exactly who fired first. What is certain is what followed. U.S. soldiers opened fire on the camp with rifles and Hotchkiss mountain guns, weapons capable of firing 50 rounds per minute. Approximately 250 to 300 Lakota were killed, most of them unarmed civilians. Their bodies were left in the freezing snow. 20 soldiers received the Medal of Honor for their actions at Wounded Knee. That decision has never been formally reversed. Wounded Knee is considered the end of the Indian Wars. Active armed resistance was over. The land was taken. Throughout the 19th century, as land was taken, native peoples were relocated to reservations. Parcels of land, usually the least desirable territory available, set aside for native occupation. The reservation system had several purposes. The most obvious was to clear native peoples from land that white settlers wanted. But there was also an ideological purpose: to confine, control, and, as many government officials put it, to civilize native peoples. Life on reservations was often desperate. The land was frequently barren, inadequate for the farming that the government insisted native people adopt. The government provided food rations, but corruption among Indian agents was rampant, and the rations were often insufficient, spoiled, or simply stolen. Starvation was common. Traditional spiritual practices were banned. Native languages were forbidden in many contexts. The traditional economy, hunting, fishing, trading, was restricted or eliminated. People who had governed themselves for thousands of years were suddenly dependent on a federal bureaucracy that was at best indifferent and at worst actively hostile to their survival. But the reservation system had one more devastating twist: the Dawes Act of 1887. After a century of wars and forced removals, native peoples in 1887 still held approximately 138 million acres. The Dawes Act, also called the General Allotment Act, was designed to break up tribal land ownership, in the name of making native people into individual farmers. Under the Dawes Act, reservation land that had been held collectively by tribes was divided into individual parcels, allotments, typically 160 acres per head of household, with smaller amounts for other family members. Tribal members would own their allotment individually. Whatever land was left over after allotments were distributed would be sold to the U.S. government as surplus, and then open to white settlers. The result was catastrophic. In 1887, Native Americans held 138 million acres. By 1934, when the Dawes Act was repealed, they held just 48 million acres. 90 million acres, the size of the state of Montana, was stripped away in less than 50 years, without a single battle. Just paperwork. And there was another dimension to this. Many native people were manipulated into selling their allotments, sometimes through fraud, sometimes through financial desperation, sometimes by being declared legally incompetent so that white administrators could sell the land on their behalf. Oil was discovered under many Oklahoma allotments in the early 20th century. The methods used to dispossess the Osage Nation of their oil wealth, including fraud and murder, inspired the 2023 film Killers of the Flower Moon. The Dawes Act was presented as a humanitarian policy. Its architect, Senator Henry Dawes of Massachusetts, genuinely believed that private property ownership would help Native people assimilate into American society. But the result was the destruction of the tribal land base that was the foundation of Native culture and sovereignty. Good intentions and catastrophic outcomes. The history of federal Indian policy is full of them. The land loss was not only physical. It was also cultural. Between the 1870s and the 1970s, that is not a typo, this lasted for over a century, the United States operated a system of Indian boarding schools. Children, sometimes very young children, were taken from their families, often forcibly, sometimes under threat of withholding food rations from parents who refused, and sent to schools far from their homes. The schools were run on a philosophy articulated by Richard Henry Pratt, who founded the first government-funded Indian boarding school at Carlisle, Pennsylvania in 1879. His stated goal: kill the Indian in him, and save the man. At these schools, children were forbidden to speak their native languages. Anyone caught speaking their mother tongue might have their mouth washed out with soap, be beaten, or be subjected to other punishments. They were forced to wear Euro-American clothing, adopt Christian names, practice Christianity, and abandon every element of their indigenous identity. Children were separated from their siblings. They were forbidden from going home for years at a time. Many never came home at all. They died at the schools from disease, from abuse, or from what we might now recognize as the physical effects of profound grief. In 2021, a similar system in Canada, the residential school program, was revealed to have buried hundreds of children in unmarked graves. In 2022, the United States Department of the Interior released a report investigating American boarding schools and found evidence of marked and unmarked burial sites at over 50 schools, with potentially thousands of child deaths. This is not ancient history. The last federally operated Indian boarding school in the United States did not close until 2023. That if you thought the land dispossession ended with the Dawes Act, it did not. In the 1950s, the U.S. government adopted a new Indian policy called termination. The idea was to end the federal government's special relationship with native nations, to, in effect, legally dissolve tribal sovereignty and assimilate Native people into mainstream American society. Between 1953 and 1964, Congress terminated the federal recognition of 109 tribes. These tribes lost their reservation lands, their federal health and education benefits, and their legal status as sovereign nations. For many tribal members, this meant immediate and devastating poverty. The Menominee tribe of Wisconsin, whose forest lands were taken and sold, saw poverty rates skyrocket overnight. Simultaneously, the government ran a relocation program that encouraged Native people to move from reservations to cities, with promises of jobs and a better life. Tens of thousands of Native people relocated to cities like Chicago, Los Angeles, Denver, and Minneapolis. The reality rarely matched the promise. Many found themselves in urban poverty, cut off from their communities, their land, and their support networks. The net effect of termination and relocation was further erosion of the land and resource base, and the creation of a new generation of urban Native Americans, people who belonged to a culture rooted in specific territories but who lived far from those territories, but Native peoples did not simply accept what was happening to them. By the 1960s, inspired in part by the civil rights movement and other liberation movements around the world, a new generation of Native activists began to organize. In 1968, the American Indian Movement, AIM, was founded in Minneapolis, originally to address police brutality against urban Native communities. AIM quickly grew into a broader movement for Native rights, sovereignty, and land return. In 1969, a group of Native activists occupied Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay, holding it for 19 months. The occupation drew massive media attention and forced the country to confront the reality of Native life. In 1972, AIM organized the Trail of Broken Treaties march to Washington, D.C., where protesters briefly occupied the Bureau of Indian Affairs building. In 1973, the most dramatic confrontation occurred when AIM members and Oglala Lakota tribal members occupied the town of Wounded Knee on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, the same site as the 1890 massacre. The 71-day standoff with federal marshals and FBI agents made international headlines and reignited public discussion of Native rights. The political pressure of this era produced concrete results. The Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act of 1975 gave tribes more control over their own affairs. The American Indian Religious Freedom Act of 1978 recognized the right of Native people to practice their traditional spiritual practices. And in 1978, Congress passed the Indian Child Welfare Act, which gave tribal governments a role in decisions about the placement of Native children in foster care. A direct response to decades of state governments removing Native children from their families at catastrophically high rates. Today, Native Americans make up about 2% of the United States population, approximately 9 million people. There are 574 federally recognized tribal nations. Together, these nations hold approximately 56 million acres, about 2.3% of the total land area of the United States. Compare that to the hundreds of millions of acres they once held. Life on many reservations remains characterized by deep poverty. The Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, home of the Oglala Lakota, has one of the lowest per capita incomes in the United States, with poverty rates that rival developing countries. Life expectancy on Pine Ridge has at times been compared to countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Native Americans experience higher rates of poverty, unemployment, suicide, substance abuse, missing persons cases, and incarceration than any other demographic group in the United States. The Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Crisis, MEUG, receives relatively little federal attention despite devastating statistics. At the same time, there are stories of resilience and reclamation. Tribal gaming revenues have provided economic development for some nations. Language revitalization programs are bringing endangered native languages back to new generations. Legal victories have restored some fishing, water, and resource rights. The Standing Rock protest of 2016, where thousands gathered to oppose the Dakota Access Pipeline, placed Native sovereignty and environmental rights back in the national conversation. And in 2009, the United States formally apologized, quietly, buried in a defense appropriations bill, with no ceremony, no media coverage, for the many instances of violence, maltreatment, and neglect inflicted on Native peoples by citizens of the United States. The apology explicitly stated it should not be construed as a settlement of any legal claim. An apology that cannot be used in court. One sentence of regret for 5 centuries of dispossession. Here is what I want you to take away from all of this. The story of how Native Americans lost their land is not just a history lesson. It is an active, living reality. The land that was taken has not been returned. The communities that were broken apart are still rebuilding. The languages that were beaten out of children are still being recovered. The wealth that was extracted, the timber, the gold, the oil, the agricultural land, built the prosperity of the United States, and its absence built the poverty of the reservations. Understanding this history is not about guilt. It is not about making anyone feel bad for being American. It is about accuracy. It is about understanding where we actually are, and why things are the way they are. The United States was not built on empty land. It was built on land that was taken. That truth does not erase the good things about America. But ignoring it does not make it disappear. It just makes our understanding of ourselves incomplete. The greatest Native American philosopher of the 20th century, Vine Deloria Jr., wrote in his 1969 book, "Custer died for your sins, we have endured. Even if it is only as myths and memories, we have endured." The native peoples of North America have endured smallpox and slaughter, forced marches and boarding schools, land theft and legal theft, termination and relocation. They are still here. And their story deserves to be told. Not as a tragedy that ended centuries ago, but as a history that shapes the present, every single day.